Now, in this book, I have a proposal which is so simple, yet it's so powerful that no one can stop us from doing it. The reason why I called this book Getting Steam to Overcome Corporatism is because of the subtitle, Build It Together to Win. So I decided, let's try an experiment for the reader. Call it an experiment, call it an experience, call it a happening. What would happen if readers who are very worried about their country and the world, they're very worried about what their descendants are going to inherit, but they don't really know what to do. What if they took this little experiment and they read short descriptions of 200 or so corporate ravages, corporate crimes, corporate greed, corporate damage across the whole continuum? You think of one abuse that's in this book, whether it's taxpayers, children, descendants, global warming, consumers, labor, government corruption, you name it, Wall Street speculation. What would happen if you read through in one sitting, and they're all short, and guess what? Most of them come from the mainstream corporate media, directly or indirectly. They've been reported in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, or in newsletters who pick up on the reports of the corporate media. So no one's going to be able to say, hey, where did you get these documentations? Where did you get these? They're all cited. Okay, so when you hear one corporate abuse on 60 Minutes, or you read about it in the paper, or somebody tells you it's happened to their friend, their cousin, their sister, their parent, how do you react? You say, that's really terrible. And a few seconds pass, and then you go back to your routine. That's a syndrome of not lacking in care. It's a syndrome of feeling helpless, powerless. Now what happens if you read 200 of these in one sitting? What happens to the fire in the belly? What happens after you finish and the aftermath presents you the following words? One can be quite self-contained and calm, yet express oneself about these business abuses and their limitless greed and cruelty with words like, quote, these people should be jailed. What they did was just awful. Or, these companies have no self-restraint. Or, corporate crime pays until it doesn't. Or, amazing how resourcefully clever they are just to think up these schemes, these tricks that take advantage of us. Disgusting, really. Or, they're just out of control. Or, where are the prosecutors, the lawmakers? Looks like the fat cats have rigged the whole system in their favor. Or, the little guy doesn't have a chance, and that's a damn shame. Or, what can we do about all this? It just seems to be getting worse and unstoppable. Even after the Wall Street crash and the Washington bailout, it's still business as usual. Or, sure, I'm mad, but I'm just one person. What can I do? Or, small business could never get away with this stuff. Or, these crooks make a mockery out of the free market. These are all comments people have made. And so you turn the page and you say, well, what can be done? And there's a concise corporate agenda. People listening or watching on C-SPAN get this information on csrl.org. That's csrl.org. Center for Study of Responsive Law, csrl.org. And I boiled them down based on our experience over the years. They cut into many stratas. Some are so obvious. Larger law enforcement budgets for smarter law enforcement and sanctions that will pay for themselves many times in fines and disgorgements. Now, people like law and order for corporate crooks. It polls very well. I mean, over 70% of the people 10 years ago said that corporations have too much control over their lives. That's a lot of conservatives and libertarians. That's not just liberals and progressives. That was a Business Week poll. And the title of the Business Week front page cover was, "Too much corporate power?" And Business Week, you know, full of corporate ads, answered yes, yes, yes in 7 detailed pages. And then had an editorial which had those memorable words, which I never forget. Corporations should get out of politics. Corporations should get out of politics. They're not human beings. The Constitution is for human beings. So, one is like, you know how small the enforcement budget is? You ever read about a situation? Let's say there's a massive street crime epidemic in New York City, and there are 200 police. What would people say? Not enough police. Where are the federal cops on the corporate crime beat? If you knew how few attorneys and prosecutors that are defending you against incredible rapacity, you'd be shocked even if you are a self-declared cynic. For example, according to the Government Accountability Office of the U.S. Congress and the leading expert on this, Malcolm Sparrow at Harvard University, an applied mathematician, 10% of everything you spend on healthcare goes down the drain due to computerized billing, fraud, and abuse. That's $260 billion this year, with a B. Would you care to guess how many prosecutors and investigators there are? According to Mr. Sparrow, a proper enforcement budget is 1% of the estimated theft, which would mean $2.6 billion. And the enforcement budget, generously estimated, is less than 1/10 of that. So, corporate crime enforcement, disgorgement of the ill-gotten gains back to the victims, very important. The second is shift of power by making facilities real easy for workers, consumers, small taxpayers, communities to band together. That means media access, it means inserts and envelopes from utilities and banks and other regulated companies, inviting you to band together with your own powerful group of champions. It means reforming the labor laws, getting rid of the Taft-Hartley Act. It means a whole series of simple facilities to give the rights and remedies that we're supposed to have any meaning. What good is a right to vote if you have to travel 100 miles by foot to a voting precinct? Facilities are very key. Third, we have to recognize, in theory, millions of people own these corporations as shareholders and investors. They have no power. The owners control the big corporations, including labor pension funds. They own these corporations. They have virtually no control. Top management has decided over the years to strip shareholder investors of any option to control their hired hands in executive suite other than to sell the stock and quit. A recipe for self-enrichment at the top and endless shenanigans by the corporation. We need effective protection for whistleblowers. People should have a right to go to work with their conscience and not leave their conscience at home and simply obey what they're told to do. That is a very important internal deterrent, and there's a bill in Congress that may pass this year that may really give both federal and corporate whistleblowers some additional protections. We need to break up these corporations. Corporations that are too big to fail, too big to tax, too big to punish, are too big to exist. They have to be broken up. Corporatism dominates them to the core. There are differences in Social Security, the nature of Medicare, although there are Democrats that want to undermine Medicare as well, Medicare Advantage, and et cetera. But on the big issues of corrupt corporate control of elections and money, militarism, foreign policy, the distortion horrendously of the public budget, where the people send the tax dollars to Washington and they are recycled for the wealthy and the powerful, and bailouts, handouts, giveaways, you name it. And almost department by department, they're very, very similar. I don't see any really difference in Department of Transportation under Obama, under Bush, under Clinton, except that there's one trend, is that they're all getting worse, regardless of whether it's Democrat or Republican, because the grip of the corporation, putting their own people in charge, the money in politics just gets worse. And the question is, they both flunk, they're both undeserving of support, and if we do support them because we think one is not quite as bad as the other, we're in complicity. If you support Obama because he's not as bad as whoever's going to challenge him, or McCain, you are in complicity with what's going on in Afghanistan and all over the world, and the Obama doctrine of prosecution, judge, jury, execution on suspicion without letting the courts or international law decide, you're complicit. There's no way out. And there are people who say, we're not going to be complicit anymore. We're going to vote our conscience, or we're going to vote for some write-in. That's the only way we can protest, unless we develop this kind of movement and other similar movements to provide more choice for the voter. You know, I mean, Norway has 7, 8 parties. Chile has 8, 9 parties. We got two major parties blocking any kind of alternative, any kind of ability to grow from one election cycle to another. And that's because we have a winner-take-all money system of politics. Here. Now, there were people before 1775 who probably were pretty despairing of the British Empire and the most powerful army in the world. And, you know, they didn't create a perfect system. But from their point of view, the farmers and the burghers, they did something pretty spectacular. They surprised themselves because they had a different level of expectation. They were irritated enough to get steam. So there is an argument to be made that dictatorial regimes bring the worst out of people, out of ordinary people, because they're so desperate. It's like, you know, the fight of all against all. They're desperate for just getting through the day, making their livelihoods. There's also an argument that a more democratic society brings the best out of people. And all of a sudden, people who you never thought would be community, neighborhood leaders, people participating in the Occupy, where do these people come from? You know, well, because they saw an opportunity to elevate themselves into society and to pursue what Senator Daniel Webster once said, the great work of human beings on earth is justice. Notice that word is the most frequent word, fairness and justice. Without justice, you can't have freedom and liberty. Well, corporatism has been very effective in pitting libertarians and authentic conservatives against liberals and progressives on many important issues. They do disagree on regulation of business, for example. But look at the areas where libertarian, authentic conservatives, like Ron Paul, and liberals and progressives agree on. They're very critical of the military budget, very critical of empire, very critical of the wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, very critical of the Patriot Act and the suppression of civil liberties, very critical of corporate and governmental invasion of privacy, very critical on the sovereignty shredding impact of NAFTA and the World Trade Organization, very willing to push for tough law and order corporate crime enforcement. That's a pretty good start. Both of them would like more investor and pension funds, mutual funds, and investor control over these runaway corporate executives. These are really important. Now, they'll disagree on unions, for example. They'll disagree on some other things. But that is a convergence, Andy, that I see emerging. Ron Paul and Barney Frank have a task force with staff to cut the bloated military budget and military contracting corruption. You couldn't have two representatives further apart on, say, the issue of unions. or federal regulation. But on that issue, they're converging. And if you look at the magazine American Conservative and The Nation magazine, sometimes if you didn't see the title, you'd wonder which one you were reading. Whether it's on military, foreign policy, the military budget. Corporate welfare is another area where there's a convergence. Libertarians dislike intensely, and their whole intellectual history, going back to their philosophers, dislike intensely. Big concentrated business that is so powerful it can go for corporate handouts and subsidies and welfare as a form of unfair competition against small business. So these are huge areas that are beginning to converge, but the companies are always trying to say, you got to go after liberals, go after liberals, they're crazy, they divide and rule. But increasingly what I'm seeing is it's coming together like this. The people who voted against that indefinite imprisonment amendment were both conservatives and liberal Democrats. So in answer to your question, those are like 10 major bridges that have doctrinal support, they have philosophical support, and they have representatives in the corridors of government that can advance it. But they got to overcome that divide and rule, diversion impact by the corporate lobbyists. And by the way, that could be the most important combination in the country politically. It was a liberal alliance with conservatives on Capitol Hill that blocked the breeder reactor and ended that boondoggle at the Clinch River in Tennessee in 1983. I mean, there are examples where once you get those two groups behind on Congress, they can be unbeatable. But they've got to deal with this divide and rule approach.